All right, picture a corridor. Most people in that palace walked past 100 times without ever really seeing it. Narrow, dim even at midday, the kind of passage built centuries ago to move staff quietly between wings without disturbing the family. Nobody expected to find royalty there. Nobody expected to find her there, alone, sitting on the cold stone floor with her back against the wall, crying in a way that suggested she'd been doing it for a long time before anyone walked in. That's where a 53-year-old woman named Eleanor found the Duchess. And what happened in the hours that followed, who was told, who wasn't, and what one formidable old woman decided to do about it, is the kind of story that never made it into any official record, because the people who witnessed it made sure of that. Hartwell Palace, the Winter Duchess Isla turned 29. It had been a hard year for her, though almost nobody outside the family's innermost circle understood exactly how hard. She'd married into a world with its own unspoken rules, its own rhythms, its own particular loneliness, the kind that comes from being surrounded by people at every hour of the day and belonging to almost none of them. She smiled for the cameras. She performed the role with a kind of grace that made it look effortless, which is exactly the problem with performing something well. Nobody thinks to ask what it's costing you. Eleanor had worked at Hartwell for 19 years by then. She wasn't senior staff. She didn't sit in on the household's private conversations, wasn't consulted on anything beyond the practical business of keeping the West Wing running the way it was meant to run. But she'd been at the palace long enough to notice things other people missed. She noticed which mornings the Duchess came down to breakfast already dressed for the day, armor already in place, and which mornings she came down looking like she hadn't slept. She noticed that the Duchess had started taking the long way to her private sitting room through the older, quieter part of the palace where fewer people were likely to be. Eleanor never said anything about it. It wasn't her place to say anything about it, but she noticed it was a Tuesday in late November when she found her. Eleanor was carrying linens down the west corridor, the one that connected the old servants' stair to the guest wing, a passage so rarely used by the family that she genuinely believed she had it to herself. She turned the corner and nearly walked straight into her. The Duchess was sitting on the floor. Not fallen, not collapsed, sitting, deliberately, the way someone sits when they've chosen the one place in the entire building where they believe no one will find them. Her knees were drawn up, her face was in her hands, and she was crying in the particular, exhausted way people cry when they've been holding something in for far longer than any person reasonably should. Eleanor froze. Every instinct she had, 19 years of instinct, told her to back away quietly, to pretend she'd seen nothing, to let the Duchess have whatever privacy this stolen corner of the palace was offering her. That was the correct thing to do. That was in fact exactly what the unwritten rules of the household demanded. But the Duchess looked up before Eleanor could retreat, and their eyes met, and there was no pretending after that. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The Duchess's face did something complicated, a flash of horror at being seen, quickly followed by something that looked almost like relief, the way people sometimes feel relief at finally being caught doing the thing they've been pretending not to need. Eleanor set down the linens without really deciding to. She didn't approach, she didn't speak first, she simply lowered herself, slowly, until she was sitting on the floor of that corridor too, a respectful distance away, saying nothing at all. "You don't have to say anything to me," Eleanor said finally, quietly, once it felt like the silence had settled into something bearable. "I'm not going to ask what's wrong. I just didn't think you should be sitting on a cold floor by yourself." The Duchess laughed, a broken, surprised sound. Not quite a real laugh, but close enough. "Everyone always wants to know what's wrong," she said. "That's the exhausting part. Everyone wants an answer they can do something about." "I don't want an answer," Eleanor said. "I just don't think anyone should cry alone in a hallway if there's someone nearby who could sit with them instead." They stayed like that for nearly 20 minutes. Eleanor never asked a single question. The Duchess never offered an explanation. When it was over, when the Duchess had finally wiped her face, straightened her shoulders, and put back on, piece by piece, the composure the world expected of her, she looked at Eleanor with something like gratitude that neither of them quite had words for. "Please don't tell anyone you found me like this," the Duchess said. "I wasn't going to," Eleanor said. "It's not mine to tell." And that, by every rule Eleanor had ever been taught, should have been the end of it. A private moment witnessed by accident, kept exactly where it belonged, inside the walls of that corridor, between the two of them, never spoken of again. Except Eleanor made one decision that broke from everything she'd been taught. She didn't go to the household manager, whose job it technically was to flag any concern about a family member's well-being. She didn't go to the Duchess's own private secretary, who would have handled it correctly, formally, and with exactly the kind of procedural distance that would have made the Duchess feel like a problem to be managed rather than a person in pain. Instead, Eleanor went to the one person in that entire palace whose judgment she trusted completely when it came to matters like this, the Queen Mother, the family's oldest living matriarch, a woman whose reputation for icy composure concealed, to those who'd worked close to her long enough to know better, an unexpectedly fierce protectiveness over the people she'd quietly decided were hers to look after. Eleanor found her in her private study, going through her afternoon correspondence, and asked, with more hesitation than she'd expected to feel, whether she might have a moment. "What is it?" the Queen Mother said, not looking up at first. It wasn't really a question. It was an instruction to explain quickly and without unnecessary preamble, which was exactly how she preferred to be approached with anything that mattered. Eleanor told her. Not everything. She didn't repeat what little the Duchess had said, because there'd been almost nothing to repeat, but she described finding her in the corridor, described the state she'd been in, described sitting with her because it hadn't felt right to leave her there alone. The Queen Mother set down her pen. She was quiet for a long moment, the fire cracking softly behind her, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its usual crispness. "How long do you think this has been happening?" she asked. "I don't know, ma'am," Eleanor admitted. "I've noticed her taking the long way through the old wing, more often lately. I always assumed it was just for the quiet. It probably was," the Queen Mother said. "Until it became something else." She sat with that for a moment, staring into the fire in a way that made Eleanor feel, briefly, like she was watching the older woman revisit some memory of her own, some earlier version of this exact loneliness, decades old, that she recognized instantly because she'd lived through something like it herself. It wasn't something Eleanor could have known for certain, but it was there in her face, plain enough that Eleanor never forgot it. "Thank you for telling me," the Queen Mother said finally, "and thank you for not making a report of it. This is not the kind of thing that belongs in anyone's file. That should have been where the story ended, a moment of kindness, quietly witnessed and quietly handled, folded back into the ordinary rhythm of the household. But it wasn't, because word of what had happened in that corridor had already, without either woman's knowledge, begun to travel through the palace in the particular way things do in houses full of people who notice everything and say almost nothing directly. It reached the household's press office within the week, not the specifics, not who had been crying or why, just a vague, second-hand rumor that something had happened involving the Duchess that the family was keeping quiet. And in a household that size, a rumor like that doesn't stay contained for long. It reached the Duchess's own private secretary, a careful, image-conscious man named Reginald, who took his job of protecting the family's public standing extremely seriously sometimes, in the Queen Mother's private opinion, a little too seriously. Reginald came to the Queen Mother directly, which was itself unusual, and asked carefully, diplomatically, but unmistakably, whether it might be wise to get ahead of the situation, whether a statement should be prepared, quietly, in case the rumor grew legs, whether perhaps the Duchess ought to see the family's physician, as a precaution, so there would be a record showing the matter had been properly addressed. The Queen Mother listened to all of it without interrupting, which Eleanor, who happened to be present, having been summoned to confirm a detail of what she'd witnessed, would later say was itself remarkable, given how visibly it annoyed her. When Reginald finished, the Queen Mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that had gone very level and very cold, "Let me understand what you're proposing. A young woman sat alone in a corridor and cried because she is exhausted and lonely and carrying more than any person should carry without complaint, and your solution is a press statement and a medical file." "I only meant to protect her, ma'am," Reginald said. "And the family, you meant to protect the institution," the Queen Mother said. "There's a difference, and I'd like you to learn it before you make another suggestion like that one in my presence." She let that sit for a moment, watching him absorb it. What she needs is not a statement. What she needs is not a doctor's note for a file some journalist might eventually get their hands on in 20 years. What she needs is for the people around her to notice she's drowning before she has to sit on a cold floor to be seen at all. Reginald, to his credit, said nothing further. He understood. The way people understand when they've badly misjudged a moment that the conversation was over. What happened over the following days took place almost entirely outside Eleanor's view. Private conversations, quiet instructions given to staff Eleanor didn't normally interact with, a noticeable and deliberate shift in how the Duchess's schedule was managed. Public engagements that had been stacked back-to-back for months were suddenly spaced further apart. A trip that had been mandatory for over a year was without explanation, quietly cancelled. Nobody announced any of it. Nobody explained why. It simply happened. The way things happen when someone with enough authority decides a problem needs solving and doesn't feel any obligation to justify the decision to anyone below her. It was nearly a month later when Eleanor learned, through a conversation she wasn't entirely meant to overhear, what the Queen Mother had actually done. She had gone to the Duchess directly, not through Reginald, not through any formal channel, and had simply sat with her, the way Eleanor had sat with her in that corridor, and told her something that apparently changed the shape of the following year, almost entirely. Nobody outside that room would ever know precisely what was said, but the effects were visible enough to anyone paying attention. The Duchess's schedule, from that point forward, carried something it hadn't carried before: space. Breathing room, days that belonged to nobody but her. And the Queen Mother, who had spent decades cultivating a reputation for being unreachable, began appearing at the Duchess's side, more often than anyone could remember her appearing at anyone's side in years. Not for official engagements, but for small, unannounced things. A walk in the garden. Tea in the old sitting room, the kind of quiet, unglamorous companionship that never makes headlines, because it isn't meant to. Eleanor watched all of it from a careful distance, the way staff do, never mentioning what she'd seen in that corridor to another living soul, not to the other maids who occasionally speculated, carefully, about what had prompted the sudden change in the Duchess's schedule, not even to her own family, who never learned that she'd been the one who found her. When people asked, gently, whether anything unusual had happened that autumn, Eleanor always said the same thing. She just needed a bit more rest, I think she'd say. We all did, that year. It wasn't quite a lie. It was the kind of discretion the Duchess herself would have wanted, the kind that protects something fragile by simply declining to hand it over to anyone who might turn it into a story. Eleanor and the Queen Mother never spoke about that corridor again. Not directly. This particular version of events is, after all, fiction, built to carry the shape of something true rather than to claim it happened exactly this way to any real person. But the shape of it echoes something real about the particular loneliness of public life, and the way exhaustion has a habit of finding people in the quietest, least expected corners of enormous buildings when they finally run out of the energy required to keep performing composure for everyone around them. The staff who witnessed it, in this story anyway, understood exactly what they'd found and exactly what it deserved. Not a press statement. Not a file. Just someone willing to sit down on a cold floor beside her and stay there until the worst of it passed. A young woman crying alone in a corridor she thought no one would ever walk down. And instead of being managed or minimized or quietly filed away, she was found by exactly the right person, at exactly the moment she needed it, and by someone whose word carried enough weight in that palace to make certain nothing stood between her and the rest she actually needed. That's the story. Whether or not anything like it has ever happened inside any real royal household, it's the kind of thing that happens more often than most people realize, not always with duchesses and matriarchs in centuries-old corridors, but with ordinary people, ordinary exhaustion, ordinary grief. Nobody notices until someone finally does. Someone breaks down somewhere they thought was private, and somebody, if they're lucky, happens to walk by who decides that what they've found deserves more than silence. It deserves to be carried, gently, into the right hands.